Thank you for tuning into my channel. Today we're going to learn how to change the size of a quilt block in a given pattern. So if you want more information about that, please stay tuned. I was asked by one of my subscribers how to change the size of a quilt block if you already have a pattern for that block. If you followed along with my beginner sampler quilt, you know that I changed the size of the block. In the book, which we're actually going to use today, the Block a Day book, these blocks all finish at 12 inches, but I changed mine to attempt to finish at 16.5 inches. And so somebody asked how you do that, and I wanted to get into that today in the video. I have several different things that we need to approach before we look at the block itself, but I'm a little bit nervous about doing this because I feel like it'll be a challenge to transfer what's in my brain so that another person can understand it as far as this goes, but I'm going to do my best. I took some notes here so that hopefully I can stay on task and stay on topic so that we can get everything done. The first thing that we're going to look at is why you might want to change the size of your block. Then we'll look at some ways to approach that block, some things to consider, and then I have some sample blocks that I want to show you. So let's go ahead and get into the video. First, we're going to talk about why you might want to change the size of a block. For me, there are several reasons that you might want to change the size of your block. The reason that I changed it in this beginner sampler was because I wanted to be able to give you measurements. Since this book was written by another person and it's not my own personal creative material, I wouldn't be comfortable giving you her measurements out of the book. So by adjusting the size of the pattern, it allowed me to decide what measurements to use so that I could share them with you. So that's the reason that I chose to do it this way. Another reason that you might want to change the size of your block would be if you want to make a larger quilt than the pattern states, but you don't want to make more blocks. So for example, if in this quilt, if the blocks are 12 inches, but I want to make the same amount of blocks, like 9 blocks, but I don't want to, I want my quilt to be bigger, I might want to change the size of the block, make each block bigger. Another reason that you might want to change the size, you might want to miniaturize the quilt. So you might want to make smaller blocks for a smaller quilt. Another thing, there's a quilt that I have in my workable stash called, I think it's called At Sea, and the pattern calls for 2.5-inch strips, but when I was cutting my fabric, I only had 2-inch strips. So I changed the size of the block so that I could, or the block is going to change because I'm using different size strips. So that's another reason that you might want to change it. The last thing that I have is that you might just want to try something different. You might want to do you might just want to do it a little differently from the pattern writer or from the original source of the block, and so you just want to change the size. As we look at this, I need to remind you that these are my own experiences, thoughts, processes, and I hope that they can help you. If you have questions about it, or if you have specific questions about you can leave them in the comments below, or you can email me at purplequiltco@gmail.com if you have specific questions or things that may take a little bit longer to answer. Okay, so now let's look at some different ways we can approach our blocks. When you want to change the size of your quilt block, you can approach it in one of two different ways. The first way that you can approach it is by unit. Now I'm going to refer to these two terms when I refer to our quilt block. One is the unit and one is the block. So let me show you using the Fields of Green block here. Okay. Now when I talk about the block, I'm talking about the entire quilt block. So all 16 squares together make the block. But when I'm talking about individual parts of the block, I'm going to call those units. So this is a quilt block that is made of 16 different units. In this case, they're all squares. And for me, this is important when you're deciding how to approach your block, because you need the unit size as you determine what your block size is going to be. And you need them both, but I just want to tell you what, when I say unit, I'm talking about an individual square or an individual part of the block. But when I say block, I'm talking about the entire piece. Okay, so one way, let me put this back. One way that you can approach your changing the size of your block is by the unit. You can say, instead of having a 4.5-inch block like Erica did, I'm going to use my 5-inch squares that are already pre-cut. Okay, and that is an absolute wonderful thing to do. If you have 2.5-inch squares and you want to make this block and you don't want to cut anything else, you can use your 2.5-inch squares to make your block. And your 2.5 inches, that will be your individual unit size, and your block will be a little bit smaller than this. So if you want to start with whatever you have, you can use the unit, whatever the unit is that you have to make your completed block. I would say that if you do that, I would suggest, if you're going to do that, make one block first, measure it, and then you'll know what your unit size is going to be. For example, if you're using 2.5-inch squares to make this block, you're going to have an 8.5-inch unfinished block. You can kind of estimate that. If you had to square it up a little bit smaller, that would be okay. But you would at least have some kind of reference point to know where to start. Okay, so you can start with your unit. You can use the unit to determine your new quilt size. The way that I'm going to approach our examples today is I'm going to consider the finished block size. I do need to use the unit to determine what that would be if you want to change the size. But you start with that finished size of your block, and then from there you determine the size of the individual units. For example, if I'm looking again at the Fields of Green block, I knew that I wanted my finished block to be 16.5 inches. And so since these are 4 units per side, then I knew that each of my units would need to be 4.5 inches to get that 16.5-inch finished block. Okay, but you need them both to determine how you're going to approach the process, whether you go by the units first or whether you go by the block first. Another thing that you will need to do is, when you look at your block, you need to figure out how many individual units make up the block, and we're going to go into that in detail with our examples. Okay, let's look at now some things to consider before you or as you resize your block. When you are thinking about resizing a quilt block, I think it's important that you, as they say, begin with the end in mind. So you want to go ahead and think about what your finished quilt is going to look like and be like. You need to think about the size of it, because the block will be the main portion of the quilt, and so you kind of need to have an estimate of how big it is. For example, if it's a lap quilt and you want to make it a twin, you need to really think about maybe those exact measurements to get a starting point for your blocks. Another thing that you need to think about is how you're going to set these blocks. Are you going to sash them? Are you going to put them side by side? Is there anything else that you need to think about as far as how big it's going to be? Another thing is borders. You need to think about the size of the quilt, and if you plan to have borders. Of course, you might not know this at the very beginning, but it'll kind of help you to start thinking about that as you get ready to resize your blocks. For example, you don't want to make your block so small that you need extra borders to flesh it out, or that you need to sash and you haven't or you make your blocks really big, and then when it's time to sash it, the quilt just blows up because it's because the fabric is so big. So consider those things before you start. Another thing that you want to consider is the shape of the quilt. If you prefer rectangle quilts, then you may want to make sure that your quilt ends up a rectangle. For example, this block behind me, or this quilt behind me, the beginner sampler quilt, it's going to be a square because there are only 9 blocks. I actually prefer rectangle quilts, and there are lots of things I could do to make it a rectangle. I could add extra borders, I could make more blocks, but I'm just going to leave it as is and let it finish as a square and just see about how big it gets. Hopefully it'll be a nice lap quilt that I can either lay under or I can give it away because I just don't prefer square quilts. Another thing that you need to really think about is the finished size versus the unfinished size of your block. The reason I say that is because you need to make sure that you include the seam allowances. If you don't, then it could make your block really tiny, and you don't want that. So as we look at our examples in a little bit, I hope I can give you some good information about determining the seam allowances and including that in your block sizing. Next, we're going to talk about how you know which. So how do you know which size is best? The good news about quilting and what makes it a lot of fun is that technically you can pick any number that you want it to be. You can pick any size that you want it to be. However, sometimes just choosing an arbitrary number can make it challenging when it comes to actually making your block, because it makes the sizing of the individual units challenging. So as we look at these blocks, hopefully I can give you some tips that can help you choose what might be the best size for your block. And the answer is different for everybody, but I hope I give you enough diverse blocks that you can kind of go, okay, using this method will be the best for helping me figure out what to do for this individual block. So I'm going to be using, of course, the Block a Day book again, but I'm choosing 4 blocks that I did not use in the beginner sampler. So I have some different categories so that we can look at how to size them. The only caveat I have is that I'm only choosing blocks that have squares and rectangles, because if it's your first time resizing a block, this way in my mind is simpler. If we add triangles, then that's a whole different animal that we would have to take care of in a separate video. But of course, if you have questions about a specific block, you can email me or you can leave it in the comments below. I would love to help if I can. All right, so the first block that we're going to look at is what she calls the Homeward Bound block, and it's right here in the book. Now what I've done is I have put this on paper so it's a little bit bigger. So hopefully you can see the grid. Now, when it comes to resizing your block, you need to really look at the unit size. Basically, this block is a 3 by 3. So 1, 2, 3 by 1, 2, 3. So when it comes to choosing a new size for this block, I personally would think about what's divisible by 3, because those are the individual units. And you can see that this center block is all squares, and so they'll be the same size. So for this block, for example, if you wanted to do a 9-inch finished block, each one of the units would start at, or would be 3 inches. And as you determine the size of your unit, you will need to add your seam allowance. And for each section, that seam allowance is, or for each unit, that seam allowance is going to be 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch on each side. So if you took this block and you made it divisible by 3, or you made your finished block size divisible by 3 to get, for example, 9 inches finished, this block would be, each of the squares would start at 3.5 inches. Okay, for our little corner spots, which are basically 4 patches, but they can be made with with a rectangle and 2 squares. So for this unit, or for this section, that whole section would need to be 3 inches, which would mean that your individual pieces would need to be 1.5 inches. Okay, so if you're looking at this from a perspective of 3s, 3 by 3, you would get 3 inches. Now I have the grid. I don't know how well you can see the grid, but I actually have it gridded in 6s. So I actually have 6 squares across the top and 6 squares along the side. But I colored everything in so that you can see that this is actual squares. Okay, so here's 1 square, 1 square, 1, 1, 1, and then our squares and rectangles are our corner blocks. Okay, anything that's divisible by 3 would probably be fine for this block. I would not try, in my opinion, I wouldn't try to make it a 10-inch finished block, because 10 divided by 3 is 3 1/3 or something like that. And if you want to add the seam allowance, it would just be kind of challenging. And then it would be even more challenging, in my opinion, to do these little corners. So in this case, using a block size that's divisible by 3 will make this one easier for you. So 9, 12, 15. You probably could do even a 6-inch finish, but it will be little tiny blocks. But it could be interesting to try. Okay, now let's look at a 4 by 4 block. The next block is going to be a 4 by 4 block, and it's called double 4 patch in the book. Here's a picture of it here, but I've also blown it up onto another sheet of paper so that hopefully you can see it more clearly. Now, for this block and for each of the following blocks, what I've done is I've put the grid, even if there's a large square like there is in this block, and even in the block that we just did, I put a grid so that you could see how the units are divided. So in this block, it is 4 by 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4 by 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and for this one, you can use a block that's divisible by 4. Okay, in my case, with the if you followed along with the quilt along, I did a ton of these blocks that are, the grid is 4 by 4. Even though they had rectangles and squares, the basic grid is going to be a 4 by 4 grid. So I would decide, you could use 16 like I did with these beginner samples. So for this block, using sizing it down to 10 inches would be great, because you'd end up with that 3-inch finished size, or going up to 16 or 20 would be okay. All you would need to do is divide that finished number by 4 and then add the 1/2-inch seam allowance for each unit. It would be basically the same for the big squares. So for example, if I wanted a 10-inch finished block, half of that would be a 5-inch block. So I would start this with a 5.5-inch square, where these little ones would start with a 3-inch square, because they would finish at 2.5, and we would add that seam allowance. So this block, for me, especially in this the beginner sampler, these blocks were very simple because I was looking at a 16-inch finished block. Okay, now let's go a little bit more challenging and go to a 5 by 5. The next block that we're going to look at is here. It's called Flying Squares, and it is a 5 by 5 block. Here it is in the book. And again, I have made it larger so that hopefully you can see it clearly. This block does have mostly squares, but it has some rectangles in it. You can see the white would be solid rectangles. And for a block that's like this, you can see that it has 5 units down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 units across. And so for this one, of course, anything that's divisible by 5 would work. I stayed away from the groups of 5 when I was choosing blocks for the beginner sampler, because 16 divided by 5 would not be easy to figure out as far as measuring and cutting. So I made sure to choose blocks that would fit better with that, with using that 16. So for this one, if you wanted to do the 10-inch square, it would be great because you would have 2.5-inch squares that you're starting with. If you wanted to go up to 15, it's just 3.5-inch squares. 20, 4.5-inch squares, and so on. So you could use this pattern, but you might want to stay away from, for example, 18 or 14 or maybe even 12. I would have to figure that out because it would end up putting you on like some 1/8 of an inch thing that you might not want to do, that might be more challenging to cut out. And so you want to pick a measurement that would make it a little bit more accessible and more fun as you begin to cut it. As you can see, to me, this block is pretty fun. I'm sort of interested in exploring it, but I want to choose a measurement for the block that will still make it fun for me, that I won't have to be stressed about when I'm putting it together. All right, the last one is a 6x6. The last block that I want to look at is the this one here. In the book, it's called a hidden 9-patch, and you can see that it looks mostly random, but they plop a 9-patch right in the middle of it. So I think that's very interesting. I remade the block. I wasn't quite as organized with my colors as they were in the example, but you can still see that hidden 9-patch. Now, this block is definitely a 6x6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 across. So when you are planning a block like this, decide if you want to use a multiple of 3. I'm not sure if they will all work, but for sure multiples of 6 will work. I stayed away from this pattern or this grid when I was in making my beginner sampler, because 16 divided by 6 would not work for me. I couldn't figure out the best way to make it ultimately work because it ended up on some 8th thing or something. It was really odd, and so I didn't fool with it. Now I do want to show you this, because even if your quilt has squares, it could still be the same grid. So even though this quilt has all small square, or this block has all small squares, this block has larger squares, but you can still look at it as a 6x6. And I wanted to make sure I show that, because depending on the blocks that you look at, they may appear to be one way, but then once you break down the grid may be a little bit different. So I would take a little more time just examining the grid before you decide your final measurement. For example, with this grid, you could do that, you could do a 12, or you could do, I think you'd do a 15, because it would be 1.5, and you would start with 2-inch squares for this one, okay? But for this one, you may choose a different number, okay? Just make sure that when you're deciding, consider the grid, consider how many units it's going to take, decide what's going to be easier for you. Don't pick a weird number that's going to be hard to get your squares cut or get your units cut. Hopefully this video has made it a little bit easier to determine how to change the size of your block. Also, why you might change the size of your block. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. You also can email me. I'll put my email again in the description so that you can email me if you have specific questions. I'll try my best to answer your questions, and I hope this video has helped you. Thumbs up this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell so that YouTube lets you know when I put out a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!